Brian and Beverly Mauck lived the kind of life that most people only dream of. A strong marriage, a home they built from scratch on 5 acres of quiet land, Sunday tailgates, camping trips, plans for a family. But one cold November morning, everything changed. A friend showed up early for a hunting trip, and the house was dark. Hours went by, and there was still no sign of either of them. And then he saw it. Through a broken door panel, it was the outline of a body. Inside the home, a television glowing brightly in the dark. A red streak across the floor. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, and if you've never been here before, I'm Kimbyrleigha. It's nice to finally meet you. The new year is about preparing for the future, for the next 12 months at least. But debt is one of those threats that you don't hear coming, so you don't usually prepare for it. It doesn't just kick down the door, it doesn't announce itself. It quietly grows over time. Interest compounds, fees stack up, minimum payments barely move the needle, and before you realize what's happening, it feels like your finances are slowly suffocated. But here's the thing. The case isn't closed because that's where our sponsor, PDS Debt, comes in. They have already helped hundreds of thousands of people break free, reduce what they owe, and finally take back control of their money. Whether you're dealing with credit cards, personal loans, collections, or even medical bills, PDS Debt doesn't just throw numbers at you. They actually take the time to understand your specific situation and build a custom plan designed around what you are dealing with, not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's also no minimum credit score required, and their entire goal is to help you save more, get out of debt faster, and start putting money back where it belongs, which is in your wallet. They're A+ rated by the Better Business Bureau. They have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and a 5-star rating on Trustpilot. And honestly, that doesn't happen unless you're actually helping people. Every single month you wait, interest and fees will keep piling up. The best time to deal with debt was actually yesterday. The second best time is right now, and I should know because it's happened to me. And when I needed help getting out of debt, this is exactly the route I took. And that's why I continue to share it with you. So don't wait for debt to strike again. Break free in 30 seconds. Get your free personalized assessment and the best option for you at pdsdebt.com/Kimber. That's pdsdebt.com/Kimber. Thanks so much to PDS Debt for helping to make this video possible. Now, let's get into the case for today. So I don't know if you noticed the intro, but this is one of my videos in the Evil Minds series. If you've never watched one of these before, they tend to be a little darker, a little more intense, and a lot more infuriating as far as I'm concerned. So let's go back. It was still dark when Jeff, who was a friend of Brian and Beverly Mauck's, pulled into their driveway on 70th Avenue East in rural Graham, Washington. It's around 5 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, November 17th in 2007. The woods behind the home were quiet. The sky hadn't even started to shift to sunlight yet. And he'd done this dozens of times before. He would meet up for Brian early in the morning for a hunting trip. Same plan, same routine. Brian would be waiting, gear by the door, coffee in hand. That's the kind of guy he was. But this time, the house was completely dark. No porch light was on, no movement inside, just the bright glow of their large TV screen flickering through a big front window of the house. At first, Jeff didn't think much of it. Maybe Brian overslept. Maybe Beverly had a late night at work. He didn't want to wake them, so he waited outside in his truck. He texted, he called, and he got no response, and he eventually drove off, figuring Brian would call back any minute. But that call never came. Hours went by. Dozens of calls went unanswered, and slowly, a feeling started to settle in that Jeff couldn't shake. This wasn't just oversleeping, because this wasn't like Brian. So Jeff turned around, and he drove back to the house. But this time, he got out of his truck, he walked up to the front door, And that is when he noticed something that he hadn't seen earlier when it was darker. One of the wooden panels on the front door near the doorknob had been kicked in, forced open, broken enough to let someone peek inside or even reach through. So he leaned in, and what he saw in that glow of the still flickering TV stopped him. He thought he saw a foot peeking out from underneath a blue blanket in the living room, and as his eyes adjusted, he realized there was blood on the floor, and it was a body, lying motionless, the shape of a person in a position that no one would sleep in. There was someone lying right there in the living room on top of a pool of blood. He didn't know if it was Brian or Beverly or someone else entirely, but something terrible had happened inside that home, and he wasn't going to open the door alone. He got back into his truck. He drove home in a panic, and he dialed 911. He told the dispatcher everything, where he had been, what he had seen, and then he turned back around a third time, this time going over there to meet deputies. When the first officer, Deputy James Wilson, arrived, Jeff was visibly shaken. He was talking fast. He was explaining everything, showing them where the panel had been kicked in, and together they approached the front door. They didn't need a key because it was unlocked. And even if it wasn't, the right bottom panel was kicked in, allowing you to be able to reach up inside and unlock the door. And the second the door swung open, Officer Wilson froze, because just inside the front door on the hardwood floors, there was blood. Not just a little blood, a long, wide trail, beginning near the entryway and stretching all the way onto the cream-colored living room carpet. It wasn't a spill, and it wasn't a small pool. This was a thick path, and someone tried to cover it up. They had thrown bed sheets and blankets on top of it, whatever they could find, in a haphazard manner, which didn't do much to hide it at all, especially because there was a massive amount of blood spatter on the wall next to the living room. So it really did no good to attempt to cover up anything as fast and sloppy as this. It looked like a frenzy killing. And at the end of that trail, 2 bodies lay crumpled together, covered with a single blue blanket, one on top of the other. There was no need to even check for pulses. They were dead. The officer backed out immediately. He radioed for homicide detectives, and he began securing the scene. But before backup even arrived, something strange happened. Jeff, who just moments ago had been right beside the officer, was gone. He just slipped away. No explanation, no word. Just vanished. As the sirens approached in the distance, the truth was this: no one had any idea what happened inside that house. Not yet, anyway. All they knew was that Brian and Beverly Mauck were dead, and whoever had done this had taken their time in that house. Even if it did no good to conceal what they had done, they had made an attempt and had been there quite a while. I want to tell you about the couple that lost their lives. Brian and Bev, even their names go together so nicely. They were the kind of couple people looked at and just got it. They looked like they were meant to be together, both with their blonde hair and their blue eyes and tan skin, almost like a real-life Barbie and Ken. And their relationship was solid. They were truly in love. They were newlyweds, and their love wasn't just for show. It was real. It was magnetic without them even having to try. Brian Mauck was the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and have half of them laughing in 5 minutes flat. He had this voice that was loud and animated and unmistakably just full of life. You didn't lose track of Brian in a crowd. You didn't need to see him because you would know he was there because you could hear his voice. He was always telling a story, always making someone laugh, and bringing just enough mischief to keep things interesting. But he wasn't loud for the sake of attention. He was passionate. He got excited easily about things like sports, a good steak on a grill, about a new tool or a project he was working on. And he brought that same energy into every part of his life. People trusted him. They relied on him. And once you had Brian in your corner, you knew you would never be alone because he was that loyal friend that you could rely on. In the middle of the night, you could call him and you knew he would answer. Brian was born on October 25th of 1977. He was raised in Washington with his sister Jennifer, and from a young age, Brian was drawn to anything mechanical. He was the kind of kid who didn't just play with toys, he took them apart. He figured out how they worked and put them back together better than before. The natural curiosity he had turned into a real skill, and by the time he graduated from Decanter High School in Federal Way, he was already known for being very hands-on. After school, Brian went into HVAC. It was hard work, and it wasn't glamorous, but he made a name for himself fast. He joined Emerald Air, an HVAC company based in Auburn, and quickly became the technician people asked for by name. He didn't cut corners, he showed up on time, and he explained things clearly. He fixed what he said he would fix, and there was no ego about it. There was no attitude, just quiet consistency in a field where that kind of reliability can be very rare. Coworkers even leaned on him. Clients always remembered him. And outside of work, Brian was the guy everyone wanted to hang out with, especially at a Seahawks tailgate party. He would show up early, he would claim his usual spot, he would fire up the grill, and he made everyone feel like they were at home, no matter how many people crowded around. And then came Beverly Slater. She was born March 16th of 1979. She grew up with her mother, Karen, her stepfather, Rick, and her brothers, DJ and Craig. Her childhood was busy, blended, and full of energy. She was the kind of person who didn't quite fit into one box. She was athletic, she was stylish, outdoorsy, thoughtful, and adventurous. She could show up camping in full glam and still be the first to light a fire or pitch a tent. And for a while, Beverly actually had dreams of becoming a professional speed skater. She was that good at it. But a serious back injury from a car accident changed everything. Most people would have stopped there, taken it as a sign to slow down. But Beverly didn't. She adjusted, and she shifted her focus. She found other ways to live a big life, and she loved the outdoors. She loved to hike, to explore, to scuba dive, and she had this craving for adventure and experience. And people loved to be around her for that reason. But more than anything, Bev was loyal. Something she and Brian had in common, even though they hadn't even met yet. She paid attention to the people that she cared about. She remembered little details. She could be soft, but she was strong-willed too. And if you were lucky enough to have her as a friend, you knew you always had someone there for you. When Brian and Bev finally crossed paths in the spring of 2001, it was easy. There was no drama. There was no question, will they or won't they last? They were completely in love. They bonded over their love for sports and the outdoors. Everything from water skiing to diving, they did it together. And people noticed how well they clicked. They were in sync. They didn't try too hard, and they didn't need to. Their lives started overlapping fast. Weekends together, trips, building routines and memories just like that. And it made sense. They were that couple who seemed like they'd already been married for years, even though they had just started dating. And in 2004, Brian proposed during a vacation trip to Cancun, and it was perfect. And 2 years later, on May 5th of 2006, they said their vows on the beaches of Turks and Caicos. It was perfect and simple and sunny and beautiful, surrounded by people who adored them. And that year, they bought 5 acres of wooded land in Graham, Washington. It was quiet, peaceful, and private. The kind of place where you could live your dream life. You could build your dream home tucked away in your own little world. And that is exactly what they did. Their house had a beautiful view of Mount Rainier, a view that was so amazing, guests would go quiet the second they saw it. It was breathtaking. Now, I'm pretty sure the house that I found on Google Maps has been completely remodeled extensively, especially the backyard. It literally looks like a backyard oasis to the extreme. It's almost like they had their own water park, even with a stone slide in the pool, and it looks like a beach. I don't think this was here when Brian and Bev owned the house, but the main part of the home was the same. The hardwood floors, the fireplaces, the 3-car garage, and all of the land. Football was also a defining part of Brian and Bev's life together. The Seahawks were important to both of them, and Sundays were treated as a commitment. Their home and their social circle adapted around that schedule. Friends and relatives knew that if the Seahawks were playing, Brian and Bev would be watching, cooking, and celebrating the game. Brian's tailgate gatherings became well known within their circle. He would get up early, turn the TV on, get started grilling as soon as he could, wings, burgers, and whatever else he felt like making that day, and it became a part of their routine. Their friends looked forward to being included. It was something Brian enjoyed creating and Bev enjoyed being a part of. And together, They represented the kind of couple who genuinely liked being with each other and who approached life with shared enthusiasm for everything that they loved and whoever they loved. They went camping often, they fished together, they rode motorcycles. They were the kind of people who didn't wait for special occasions to make memories. They just lived, and they were very loved. They treated others the way that they wanted to be treated, with warmth and humor and generosity, and they didn't ask for attention. They gave because they genuinely wanted to, and they cared. And at the center of everything was them, Brian and Bev, a couple who built something together to share for a lifetime. They were planning to have kids. Bev had just taken a job closer to home as a secretary at a car dealership. She was making good money. They both were, and everything was lining up. They had the house, the land, the marriage, the future, and no one could have imagined how quickly it would be taken away. So let me take you back to that early Saturday morning on November 17th of 2007. It was still dark outside when the first sign of unease appeared. A chilly morning in Graham, Washington. Like I said, the sky hadn't even started to get light. Most of the homes on that rural stretch of road were still quiet. Windows were dark. Coffee makers weren't even running yet. At the Mauck property, that quiet felt completely normal until it didn't. Brian had made plans that morning, and he wasn't the type to sleep through them and back out. He had a hunting trip scheduled with his friend Jeff, and they were supposed to meet before sunrise. Jeff was someone who had done this routine with him before. They lived on the same street in this rural neighborhood and had become friends and enjoyed hunting together. But when Jeff arrived around 5 a.m., the house was pitch black. No porch light. No hallway glow from the bedroom. The only visible thing from outside was the television. It was flickering brightly from the big window in front. It was probably left on from the night before, he thought. And as I explained, Jeff waited. He called, he texted, but there was no answer. And eventually he assumed Brian had just changed plans or overslept, and he drove off. Nothing felt urgent yet. But when hours passed and there was still nothing, no calls, everything was still going to voicemail, no text, no activity, eventually that feeling, the one that we all tried to push away, started to grow. The one that says something is not right. So, on his way back down to his house, Jeff went back to Brian's. And this is when he got out of his truck. He walked up to the front door, and that's when he saw the panel of the wooden door just beside the doorknob was completely missing. He realized it was inside. It had been kicked in. You could see right into the home or reach in, like I said, to unlock a deadbolt. And what Jeff saw when he looked through that opening was terrifying. These are the type of things the brain can't explain right away. The sight of a body in an awkward position, unmoving in the glow of that TV set. From the outside, Jeff could only see part of the living room, but it was enough. He knew what he was looking at. It wasn't someone asleep on the ground. It wasn't a fall. It wasn't an accident. This was violent. And this is where I left off. Jeff and Officer Wilson making their way inside. I told you about the blood trail that stretched from the front door to the living room, and it wasn't just large. We're talking 3 feet across and roughly 15 feet long. And you know I have to blur everything because we're talking about a platform that doesn't like uncensored things. But it was strange. It moved in multiple directions, like someone had walked through it, dragged something across it, and then smeared it deliberately. There were weird lines and marks running through it, and blankets and sheets had been tossed across parts of the floor, not to absorb the blood, but to try to hide it. You could tell the killer did not care about being neat. This wasn't someone trying to erase the crime. It was someone trying to mask just enough to buy them some time, maybe in case someone looked through the Mauck's large front windows. They didn't have drapes or blinds, and that blood would have stood out against that light-colored hardwood floor. This killer was someone who thought they had time to spare. And that alone told this officer something important. Whoever did this wasn't afraid of being caught. This seemed reckless and chaotic. And near the center of the living room, there were the 2 victims. It's ironic that it's called a living room, a place where the living are no longer in this case. And it was Brian and Bev, even though they were not officially identified yet. Together in life and together now in death. At first, it seemed like it could be a situation where one of them hurt the other and then themselves, but a quick look at the surrounding area proved that theory was highly unlikely or impossible, considering there was a blanket on top of both of them and no weapon nearby. At this point, Deputy Wilson backed out immediately, knowing what this was: a double homicide. He radioed for the homicide division and CSI to respond to the scene immediately. And while he stood just outside the threshold, processing what he had just seen, he turned around to speak with the man who called 911, Jeff, the one who had claimed to be a friend of Brian's. But he's gone. And that seemed off. But he thought maybe he got spooked. Not everyone can handle the sight of death. Pierce County Homicide Detective Sergeant Benjamin Benson arrived on scene next. He was a seasoned investigator with 3 decades of experience, level-headed, methodical, calm under pressure, but even he would say later that walking into the Mauck's house that day rattled him. From the moment he stepped inside, Benson knew this wasn't a robbery, this wasn't impulsive, this was methodical, intentional, and controlled. The house wasn't ransacked. Nothing had been overturned, electronics, valuables, they had been left untouched. And then there was the blood. The marks weren't consistent with the struggle. It looked like someone had dragged something or someone through it. But there were more patterns in it that seemed almost like someone was finger painting or creating a design. It was strange. It didn't make sense. The thick trail got thinner as it neared the carpet, and then it was about as wide as a body. So that part made sense, because one of the victims must have been killed near where the trail began, close to the entryway, and dragged to the living room. And then the killer decided to disturb that trail in some way. For some reason, Benson saw more blood near the kitchen. And that's when he saw something that seemed very out of place. Well, maybe not usually, but the way it was laying and what was on it. It was a broom, soaked in blood, lying near a bloody rag. At this point, the spray of blood on the wall made sense. It was cast off from a broom. This was far from a cleanup job, though. It seemed like someone frantically rushing around trying to figure out what to do next, and they spent at least a couple hours on that mission to remove evidence that they had been there, and then it was like they just decided to leave. That's risky. Sticking around that long? Forensic technicians noted minor discrepancies as well that showed what the killer was doing. Doorknobs had been wiped down, but not with a clean towel. Light switches had blood smears all over them, and they had been wiped too, but not cleaned. It left smudges, as it was hand-wiped with a bloody cloth, probably the rag they saw on the floor. It was enough to suggest an attempt to remove fingerprints or even DNA, but it wasn't done well. It's a red flag, because who stays at a scene of a double homicide long enough to sweep the floors? Maybe someone who knew these victims, someone who knew he wouldn't be interrupted, someone who felt comfortable in that space. And as Benson made his way to the bodies, he took in every detail. By now, they both had been identified. Once the blanket was removed, there was 28-year-old Bev. Her body was draped on top of her 30-year-old husband, Brian's. She was nude, and they were positioned in the shape of the letter T. Brian was sprawled out straight and found face down in the living room on the floor. His arms were tucked beneath his torso, and he was still fully clothed in jeans and a t-shirt. And Bev was across his upper body, making the top part of the T. The fact that he was clothed and she wasn't, that contrast struck the investigator immediately. It raised questions that they weren't able to answer yet. What had gone on here? Was this staged? Was there a sexual element to it? Or had Bev simply been caught off guard while she was asleep? Many people do sleep without clothing, and Benson didn't want to jump to conclusions. He had worked way too many cases to assume anything about staging or intent, but he took notice. One thing was clear. This attack happened very fast. There were no signs that any struggle occurred. Nothing in that home indicated a drawn-out altercation. This was more of an ambush. The bodies were then transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsies to be conducted. The examinations revealed that both Brian and Bev had been shot 3 times at close range with a .22 caliber handgun. Brian was shot twice in the back and a 3rd time in the right side of his head. The positioning suggested he had been shot from behind, probably after turning away from the killer, and then in the head for good measure to make sure that he was dead. Bev had also been shot 3 times, twice in the back of the head and once right between her eyes. That fatal shot was described as a finishing shot, a bullet that's fired at point-blank range with the clear intention of making sure your victim is dead. It's brutal, and it's absolutely chilling what happened to this couple. It seems so cold and so personal. However, even though Beverly was unclothed, there were no signs of sexual assault, and there were no defensive wounds on either of them. So they hadn't fought back. They probably didn't even have time to try. And then came the physical evidence. Once the CSI team lifted the blankets from the floor and uncovered that thick trail of blood, they noticed what appeared to be a bloody zigzag shoe print beneath the sheet, preserved in now drying blood. The killer must have stepped onto the sheet after putting it in place, thinking that he was avoiding the blood getting on his shoes, but the sheet was thin, and as the killer walked over it, they pressed the tread of their footwear onto the fabric and then right into the blood underneath. The sheet had acted almost like a time capsule, shielding the print from disturbance. It's preserved, just as it was when it was made. Now this could be what the killer was trying to remove from that thick streak of blood to begin with. He took that broom to erase away that distinctive footprint so they wouldn't be left behind. And as he pushed and dragged the broom through that blood, it created the elongated streaks that investigators had seen near the doorway. The sweeping motion also accounted for that fine spatter I told you about that was on the adjacent wall. All of that work that the killer put in, and he must not have had a clue that one footprint remained hidden by that sheet that he placed on top to cover his tracks. More forensic evidence emerged in the southeast corner of the home. On the door jamb of the primary bedroom, roughly 5 feet above the floor, technicians noticed a reddish impression, and at first glance, it looked like a fingerprint. But its placement and its angle were off. The ridge pattern was oriented upside down in an unnatural position for someone placing a finger on the surface at that height. It would have had to be placed there if someone stood, let's say, on a ladder or a step stool, and maybe use their hand to brace themselves while cleaning or while thinking or while wiping down something out of reach. But upon further inspection, they realized it wasn't a fingerprint in blood, it was a palm print, because palm prints, I didn't even know this, they are almost like an upside-down pattern when you're looking at them compared to a fingerprint, but it was preserved for analysis. And there was another detail that stood out to Benson, the TV being on. There was no indication the victims had been watching TV when they were attacked. So to Benson, the more plausible explanation was chilling, that the killer had turned on the TV and kept it on while he attempted to clean up. It contributed to the sense the suspect did not rush, but he stayed inside the house longer than most offenders would. And for a minute I wondered, did this person sit down and watch TV after committing such a brutal crime? Think about that. Either way, it's horrifying. Once the CSI had finished documenting the interior of the Mauck's home, Detective Benson took a step back to absorb the bigger picture. Not just what was there, but what wasn't. Nothing about this crime scene pointed to a robbery. Brian had cash in his pocket. He had several firearms that were left untouched. They were in plain sight, easy to grab, and ignored. And there was, of course, valuables in the house. Jewelry, electronics, all there. Exactly where they should have been. So whatever happened inside that house, it wasn't about stuff. It was about them, Brian and Bev. From the blood patterns and body positioning, investigators concluded that Brian had likely been shot from behind soon after the killer came into his home. And this detail was important. Was Brian waiting for them while Bev was already in bed? If Brian opened the door, then why was the panel kicked in? Detectives worked through the most probable scenario. Brian heard a knock at the door. He got dressed, left the bedroom, and went to the front door. Saw who was on the other side, and didn't want to let them in. So he turned around to walk away, and that's when the killer kicked the panel out of the door and was able to unlock the door from reaching inside. As Brian turned towards the living room, he was shot from behind and fell right where he was found. The trajectory of the first shot, followed by 2 shots to his back, aligned with the shooter standing behind him almost immediately after he would have turned away from that door. Benson believed that Bev, being found in the nude, indicated she was asleep when the attack occurred. She most likely heard the commotion of the door being kicked in, or Brian and the killer in an argument of some kind, and she jumps out of bed to find out what's going on without any time to get dressed. So whatever this woman heard, it must have been that concerning to her. She could have possibly heard the gunshots. And once she made it to the living room, she probably saw the shooter and attempted to run towards the door for help. And as she did, she was quickly shot. 2 shots, right to the back of her head, followed by that one final shot between the eyes just when she fell to the ground to make sure she wasn't getting back up. After that, her body was dragged back towards the living room and positioned on top of Brian's, and then covered with a sheet taken from their own bedroom. It matched the other bed sheets. And then the cover-up began for the next couple hours. Once the crime scene had been fully cleared and Brian and Bev's bodies were transported away from the home, Detective Ben Benson shifted back into procedure. The chaos was now quiet, but the work was far from over at this point. There was one loose end that he needed to address immediately. The man who had found them, Brian's friend, identified as Jeff Freitas. Benson had unanswered questions, and they weren't small ones, because over the years, he had learned that killers don't always run. Sometimes they do the exact opposite. Some offenders report their own crimes. Others will insert themselves into investigations as witnesses, and some make a show of being helpful and cooperative and eager, while quietly doing things that don't quite add up and getting information about the crime. Jeff's behavior that morning stood out. He had been present when the bodies were discovered, and then, without explanation, he just leaves the scene. Now that's not typical, not for an innocent witness, not for someone who had just discovered who he called 2 close friends dead inside their home. He said he'd been hunting, so that meant he had a gun. Benson couldn't ignore that. So the next step was obvious. He needed to find Jeff and sit him down and walk through everything to determine whether his role truly ended with the discovery of the bodies or whether it went deeper than that. And it wasn't hard to find this man. He lived about 1,000 feet up the street from the Maucks. No wonder he could have just slipped away easily. He probably just walked home. When detectives brought him in for a formal interview, they began where they always do, with the timeline. And Jeff explained that morning, like I already told you. Wanted to go hunting. Brian didn't answer. He went hunting alone, then came back to figure out what happened. But hunting by himself stood out. It meant no witnesses, no one who could confirm where he was during that critical window when Brian and Bev were killed. Hunting alone wasn't unusual for Jeff, but from an investigative standpoint, it meant that every part of his story had to be examined very closely. As the interview continued, detectives gently pressed Jeff about his relationship with Bev and Brian. He said the 3 of them were good friends. He'd gotten to know them when they moved on his street. They spent weekends together, they played cards, they barbecued, socialized regularly. And according to Jeff, they never had been in any arguments. There had never been any tension, never anything resembling a dispute that could ever escalate into violence, and he didn't do this. Now, nothing in his answers suggested he was lying, and nothing even pointed to a motive. Detectives aren't just listening. They're watching everything. Body language, pacing, the way his voice cracked when he talked about finding Brian and Bev. But as they dug deeper, Jeff had no criminal history. He had no known issues with the Maucks or anyone else. And through the course of this interview, his emotional state was consistent. He appeared genuinely shaken. His hands would tremble. His tone was uneven, and his anxiety was visible and raw. This completely tracked with what detectives often saw in people who had made a gruesome discovery like this, something they were never prepared for. And to Benson, nothing about this felt rehearsed. But still, he had to be careful. First impressions can definitely be wrong, and criminals can lie really well. Experience taught him never to rule someone out too early, especially someone who had been inside that home and left before speaking to detectives. So while Jeff didn't look like the killer that they were looking for, he also wasn't cleared. At that point, he remained a person of interest. Not the most compelling suspect, but still someone they couldn't afford to just overlook. But as word of the murder spread through Graham, it went beyond to the surrounding communities. The news moved really fast, faster than the official notifications ever could. And it didn't come in the form of a knock on the door for this family or a phone call from sheriffs. It came through word of mouth. Karen, Bev's mom, got the news way too soon, and not in a way that anyone would have wanted. One of her friends called her. They said there had been a murder. They said it happened in Graham. They said they thought it was Brian and Beverly. Karen lived 30 minutes away in Milton, and the moment she heard those words, her body just went still. She said this had to be a mistake. Her daughter being murdered inside the home that she poured her heart into, it sounded impossible to her, like it was a rumor terribly gone wrong or a case of mistaken identity. Bev was young, she was healthy, she was happy, newly married. She'd just started building the life that she always dreamed about for so many years. So Karen told herself it couldn't be real. But the calls didn't stop. More people reached out. Some of them were confused, some of them were terrified. And the more Karen heard it from different voices coming from different places, the harder it became to hold on to hope that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. And that's when the panic set in. She was screaming and saying, I have to get out there. I have to get out there over and over again, like it was a chant, because she had to see things for herself. Karen grabbed her keys and she drove straight to the property. When she pulled up, deputies were already there. Their cruisers were parked at the edge of that long driveway, and yellow crime scene tape stretched across the front yard. Karen tried to walk towards the house because all she wanted to do was step on that porch, open the door, and see her baby girl. She wanted to touch her. She wanted to know for sure, even if that meant facing the worst. But officers stopped her. They told her gently but very firmly, you cannot go inside. Crossing that threshold would contaminate the scene. But to Karen, this wasn't a scene. It was where her daughter lived. Of course, the evidence inside was vital to understanding what happened to her daughter and her son-in-law. They couldn't risk compromising it. But mothers aren't thinking like detectives, they're thinking like mothers. All she wanted to do was comfort her daughter, to be there for her, even if she was gone. She was still in there, but Karen just couldn't get to her. She just stood there, frozen, outside the house that her daughter had so carefully made into a home, unable to move, unable to hold her own child. For both the Mauck and the Slater families, what happened was unthinkable because Brian and Bev, they weren't the kind of people who had enemies. They were kind, dependable, gentle, the kind of couple you trusted, that you invited to every get-together. They wanted kids so bad. It was part of their plan, and they were ready. And Karen's heart broke, knowing they would never get that chance. She knew they would have made amazing parents. Over and over, their families repeated the same sentiment, not to convince the detectives, but to try to convince themselves. They would say there's no one who would want to hurt them. There's no one that hated them. This doesn't make sense. But somewhere inside that blur of grief and disbelief, Karen remembered something. Someone that her daughter had told her about. Someone she had worried about long before the murders. Even in the disoriented fog of loss, Karen was focused enough to speak up. She told detectives there was a specific person they needed to look into right away because Bev didn't keep things to herself. When something made her feel unsafe or scared or uneasy, she would speak up. And Karen knew she had to now. Karen was usually the first person that Bev told. And Bev had told her something about a man, a name that she could not get out of her head. Someone who made Bev extremely uncomfortable. A young man named Jeremy Flynn. He was 21 and he lived just a few doors down. And about 6 weeks earlier, there was a small party at Brian and Bev's house. Friends were there, they were drinking, it was just a casual night in. But not everyone there belonged. And not everyone brought good energy. The moment that Jeremy walked in, something felt off. Now, Karen wasn't there that night, but Beverly had called her afterwards and she was entirely unsettled. She told her mom that Jeremy had gotten heavily intoxicated and he started acting loud and angry. And at one point, he started making really inappropriate comments at her about her appearance. His tone, it was invasive, it was inappropriate, and it was aggressive. At first, Bev tried to just brush this off in the moment to avoid making a scene, but Karen could tell that it bothered her. And when Jeremy's behavior went from annoying to confrontational, Brian stepped in and he asked him to leave. This should have been a simple request that was followed without a problem, but it nearly turned physical. Jeremy didn't leave quietly. He was loud and belligerent. He felt insulted. And eventually, when he did stumble out the door, the mood that night entirely shifted. And the feeling he left behind didn't fade. It left such a bad impression on Bev that she told her mom she never wanted Jeremy inside their home again. But that is not all. The next morning, Brian and Bev realized that several things were missing from their home. 1, Bev's cell phone was missing. And 2, a .357 Magnum, a handgun that Brian kept securely stored, but it was accessible. Nothing else from the house had been taken, and there was only one person they suspected, Jeremy. But they didn't file a report because Jeremy was related to one of their close friends, and they didn't want to start drama or stir up tension in their social circle. They assumed it was just a stupid, drunk decision, one that might resolve itself. They didn't see him as a threat. But Bev certainly didn't forget that night. She later told her mom she didn't trust Jeremy at all. She didn't like the way he looked at her. And she didn't like his erratic energy that he carried with him. And she didn't feel safe in the house alone if Brian wasn't there. I told you that Jeremy only lived a few doors away. It was walking distance. And that detail made Karen even more uneasy about her daughter being alone and now being murdered. And while she's standing outside that taped off crime scene, Karen could not stop thinking about all this. She knew her daughter. She knew when something really scared her, and she had a right to be afraid. This was more than a bad party. It seemed like it was more than just a phone missing and a gun stolen, because in her gut, Karen believed Jeremy had come back, and this time he crossed the line and he destroyed this couple. Detectives took Karen's statement seriously. It wasn't just the grief talking. She was so calm and focused and specific. It wasn't like she was trying to guess who did something. She was trying to tell them something that she knew. So they began digging into Jeremy Flynn, and almost immediately, they realized that Karen had a right to be worried. Jeremy wasn't just a local troublemaker. He had a juvenile record, and he had been tied to multiple burglaries and thefts in that area, and he was known in the neighborhood for having a short fuse, especially from flipping from friendly to aggressive in seconds when he was drinking. People who lived nearby had used the same words over and over to describe him: unpredictable, volatile, and difficult to confront. He wasn't the kind of person you would expect to maybe plan a double homicide, but he was the kind of person who could snap. And when you looked at the timeline, the stolen handgun, the party incident, the close proximity, it seemed to fit. The team made locating this man a top priority. Even if it wasn't the same caliber gun that was used in the crime, he could have owned others. But right away, they hit a wall. The first address on file for Jeremy wasn't even real. When officers drove out to check the property, there was nothing there. No house, no trailer, no mailbox, just open ground. They even double-checked the number, and they ran it through a system again, and they confirmed the address listed on his criminal record didn't exist. Now, the second address was about 30 minutes from the Mauck's property. It was his mother's home, and they went there next, hoping there would be a sign of him. When detectives arrived, Jeremy's mother said she hadn't seen him recently, and she didn't know where he was. She seemed genuinely concerned and worried about her son, especially now that police were there. She didn't deny that he had a past. She didn't try to explain it away, but she just said, "I don't know where he's gone." Detectives asked for names of friends, jobs, places he might be, and she gave him what she could. A few vague references, but nothing concrete. This was literally like chasing a shadow. Everywhere they went, they got nowhere, and they checked old contacts, they called numbers, they drove out to houses where he had once stayed with friends, but each one of them was either a dead end or months out of date. Jeremy moved a lot, and he didn't always tell people where he was going. He would just leave, and he rarely came back. And by the third day, investigators had this feeling that this guy wasn't just out visiting friends, he was avoiding them. And now with 2 people murdered and a missing gun from the Mauck's home, Jeremy had officially moved from a person of interest to an active suspect. They needed to find him before anyone else got hurt. With Jeremy Flynn still missing and his trail going colder by the day that passed, detectives had no choice but to widen their search. If no one in the Mauck circle had seen anything, maybe someone outside did. So they went back to basics. They were boots on the ground, going door to door in the neighborhood, down the winding road surrounding the private road that the Maucks lived on. It was rural, it was thick with trees, scattered homes, long driveways. But all it took was one person, one neighbor, one window at the right angle who might have seen something. And they find 2. To the right of the Maucks was a home, and its side windows would have caught something, and a couple houses down from the Maucks' residence. At the very end of 70th Avenue East lived a married couple, Daniel and Jennifer Travaris. Their mobile home sat on a stretch of land owned by Jennifer's brother, Jeff. Yes, that Jeff, the friend of the Maucks who found the bodies and was already interviewed. I told you, he lived just down the road. Well, Daniel and Jennifer's temporary mobile home sat right beside Jeff's house, blocking Jeff's view from his windows. But Daniel and Jennifer's mobile home was across the street from the Maucks, so more of their windows could have possibly allowed them to witness the person breaking in, or running from the house, or even the crime taking place. And they say that right from their bedroom window, they can see the Maucks' driveway. If you're watching, I'm showing you this on the screen so you can make sense of what I am saying, that they would have had a better view because of the way their mobile home was parked. So the detectives go there first. 1, because they're connected to one of the Maucks' friends, Jeff, and 2, because of the positioning of their mobile home. Daniel answered the door and was quick to offer any information that could be of assistance. First, they let the detective know that they were acquaintances of Brian and Bev. Jennifer and Daniel had only lived there since July, but they had gone over to parties a couple times at the Maucks residence, and Daniel was also a tattoo artist, and he'd been working on a piece for Brian. Daniel said that around 7 o'clock in the morning on November 17th, the day of the murders, he and his wife Jennifer had been awoken by the sound of gunfire. But like most people in that area, they didn't think much of it. Out in Pierce County, gunshots didn't immediately mean danger. Early morning hunting was common. But still, curiosity got the better of him, especially since it sounded so close by. So Daniel said he and his wife got up, they walked to their window, and they looked towards the road, and that's when they saw a red pickup truck parked in front of the Maucks' home. And it didn't belong there. He noticed the loud exhaust, and he watched as a man walked out of the house. And because of the gunshots and the strange vehicle, Daniel watched the man and took in every detail. He described him as a white male. He was tall, around 6'2", and at least 230 to 240 pounds, with long hair pulled back into a ponytail and a pockmarked face and facial stubble like someone who hadn't shaved in days. He said he thought there could have been a second man in the passenger seat of the truck, but he couldn't say for sure because of the lack of light and the angle. But what he remembered the most was the way the truck had quickly backed out of the driveway and turned and sped away. Jennifer saw it too, the red truck, and she remembered it being loud, and she remembered a man coming out of the Maucks' house. Now, she did not describe him the way Daniel did. She said she wasn't sure how tall he was or what his facial features were, but she saw him. But to her, he seemed like a friend just visiting the Maucks until she heard about the homicides. Now she thought it was suspicious. And for the record, her brother Jeff doesn't drive a red truck, so it wasn't his truck from coming to pick up Brian. But could it have been Jeremy Flynn? Well, he didn't drive a red truck either, but could he have been in the passenger seat? He did not match the description of the driver, though. Jeremy was young, he was a little bit stocky, but he kept his hair in a buzz cut, and he was still missing. So there was no way to get in touch with him and question him about anything, including his whereabouts. To detectives, though, this finally felt like a break. The first real visual confirmation that someone was at that scene around the time of the murders. They noted every detail. And it wasn't a lot, but it was more than they had. And now they had at least a direction. First, they tried to connect this red truck to someone within the Maucks social circle. Did Brian or Bev know someone who drove a red pickup truck? Did they hang out with anyone who looked like the man that was described? No. There were no friends, no coworkers, no family, no neighbors that matched these descriptions. And that was a problem. Because in rural Pierce County, red trucks, they're common. Still, this was the best lead they had, so detectives began reviewing records. They're running vehicle tags or cross-referencing truck owners with anyone that could be tied to this couple or anyone with a criminal history. But nothing lined up. And meanwhile, efforts to find Jeremy continued. There was one more location left that they hadn't checked yet. It was an address that Detective Benson wasn't able to earlier because he was called back when the autopsies were completed. Now, this location was further out. It was about 10 miles from the Maucks' home, deep in the woods and very isolated, the kind of place that you wouldn't just stumble upon. And by this time, He needed help on this case, so he was accompanied by a brand new detective, Jason Tate. Now, he wasn't new to law enforcement, but he had just become an official detective and he was ready to solve his very first homicide case. When they arrived and they reached the address, the house was gone. It was burned down. And what was left was like a skeleton of a home because everything had pretty much been erased. There were charred boards, collapsed walls, scorched dirt, tires melted into the ground, bits of twisted metal, which was the only clue that furniture or appliances had ever been inside that home. There were, of course, no footprints, no fresh tire tracks, no sign that anyone returned recently. And when they checked with the local fire department, they also found no incident record, no record of this fire at all, no timeline or anything. No one had called it in. No one had responded to the scene. And that meant no one knew when this blaze had started or who had been there before it burned. Benson just stood there, staring at the smoldering shell of this house, and he's trying to piece everything together. Was this just a coincidence that some abandoned house caught on fire in the middle of nowhere? Or had someone burned it on purpose to destroy evidence, to sever any ties from Jeremy Flynn to the murders? They couldn't say. But what they could say with absolute certainty was this. The only remaining physical address tied to Jeremy Flynn had just turned into another dead end. Now, the silence surrounding this case, it didn't just stall the investigation. It started to shake this entire community. Word was spreading. 2 people had been murdered. Not in some distant town, not in a bad part of a city, but right there, in their little paradise, a quiet rural road in Pierce County. People who lived there in Graham for decades said they'd never seen anything like this. This was the kind of place where neighbors waved from their driveways, where they certainly left their doors unlocked. Crime felt really far away, like something like that happened in other places to other people. But now it was one of them. Brian and Bev Mauck? Killed in their own home, and no one knew who did it? Rumors traveled faster than patrol cars could. And from house to house, family to family, the same questions were echoing through this community. Was it random? Was it someone they knew? Was it going to happen again? And with no suspect in custody, the fear only got deeper. As far as anyone knew, the killer was still out there and possibly hiding nearby, somewhere in the same wooded stretches and the winding gravel roads where children played and families sat down for dinner. People started to lock their doors. They were watching headlights through the blinds. They were second-guessing the neighbors that they once trusted without thinking. And while detectives kept tight control over what they released, trying not to spook whoever was responsible, all they had was one name, Jeremy Flynn. And even that was starting to fade. He disappeared. No one had seen him. No one could find him until he found them. Because out of nowhere, the suspect that they'd been chasing for days calls the police himself. Jeremy contacted investigators directly. He said his mother told him they were looking for him. And he sounded oddly calm. He said, "I'm not on the run. I'm not hiding. I'm staying with a friend. I'm 10 miles away." He hadn't realized the detectives were even looking for him. He told them, "I want to clear my name before the rumors get out of control." He wasn't avoiding them, he said. He was trying to avoid being falsely accused, though, and most importantly, he said, he could prove he had nothing to do with the murders. He told detectives he had an alibi. And when he shared it with him, 3 of his friends confirmed they were out drinking that night nowhere near the Mauck's house. And when they checked, the alibi was solid. And for now, he's moved to the back burner. And if you're frustrated with all of these dead ends, just imagine how these investigators and the family felt. And speaking of the families, in the days after the murders, nearly 700 people gathered to honor Brian and Beverly Mauck. The service was held at the Federal Way Community Center, and the turnout was huge. The main auditorium filled up fast, and people lined the back walls. They crowded into the hallways. They stood wherever they could find space. This wasn't quiet grief. People were crying all around, leaning on one another. These people came from every part of the Mauck's lives. Family, lifelong friends, coworkers, neighbors, people who had known them for decades. People who had met them once. It didn't matter. There were people there that only exchanged a smile in passing, and they still wanted to say goodbye. Many of them were wearing Seahawks jerseys and sweatshirts and hats, which was a tribute to the Sunday rituals that Brian and Bev were known for. Their tailgates, their group text during kickoff, their dinners built around the games. The couple didn't just love football. It was part of their community. So that community brought that love right back to them. And inside that service, it wasn't exactly what you would expect at a memorial. Yes, I told you there was grief, but there was also laughter and stories, and people spoke about Brian and his booming voice and his presence and the way that he would just take over a room without trying. He was the kind of man whose energy was contagious, whose laugh turned strangers into friends. And they talked about Beverly, how warm she was, how loyal, effortlessly kind, the way she made people feel like they were valued. Friends told stories about camping trips and motorcycle rides, about spur-of-the-moment get-togethers that turned into some of their favorite memories, about how Brian and Bev made the most ordinary nights feel like little adventures. And as each person stepped up to speak, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about who they were. It was about how they made people feel. That's what stayed behind. But back at the investigation, detectives were still circling the same question. Who killed this couple? They thought that palm print may provide an answer. Just like there's a database like APHIS that handles fingerprints, there's also a palm print database. I had never heard of it before, and I've done so many cases, and you might not have either. But it's called Morpho, and it's specialized as a system designed to match palm print impressions that are found on crime scenes to criminals' prints that have been found in other crimes. But unfortunately, when they ran that palm print from the Mauck's home through the system, there was no match. This meant whoever left that print there either had no palm print on file because they had never committed a crime, or at least not a crime where that type of print had been left behind, or they had committed a crime, but they had never been caught. So the last promising item they had was the shoe print. And after taking photos of the impression and lifting it from the scene, a specialist also used a database for footwear soles, and it was a match to a Madsen brand work shoe. This was an industrial type of boot worn by people that work in construction and other trades that need a durable and protective shoe. But both the palm print and the shoe impression wasn't going to be much use unless they had a suspect to compare these things to. And for several days, the red pickup truck sighting was their best lead. Daniel and Jennifer Tavares' account, the tall, heavyset white man with the long hair and a ponytail, had been oddly detailed. It was more vivid than most witness statements, almost too vivid. And Detective Benson wrote it down like he always did, and he filed it away. But then he reran the description they gave through his mind. And something about it just stuck out to him. It was too specific, and that left him with a difficult truth. The most compelling lead in this case had come from a neighbor who said they saw someone leave the scene, but that someone didn't seem to exist. And their mobile home wasn't exactly close to the Mauck's residence. So it was starting to feel like this didn't quite fit. Benson had interviewed enough witnesses to know how shaky real memories usually are. People misremember times, they mix up cars and colors, they forget faces, especially after being awoken from a sleep in the early morning from a distance. But not Daniel. He seemed to remember everything. Hair length, facial stubble, a ponytail, even what he referred to as pockmarks. Really? So Benson decided to test it. Now, personally, I'm not sure if this test was even necessary the way it was carried out. I mean, because he was a licensed pilot. And whether he just decided to go take a flight and go over to that area and look at it from above at a bird's eye view, or if he deliberately used his plane to get a different vantage point, I'm not sure. But the fact is, this detective flew over the neighborhood, circling above the Tavares trailer, following the line of sight to the Mauck's property. And from this angle, something became very obvious. The two homes were not close by. And I was thinking to myself, you could actually just driven out there, stood at the mobile home and looked across from the window to the house, or even looked at a map and you could see the distance between them. It is much farther than it appears on a map, though. a long stretch of open land with no trees, no fences, and nothing blocking the view. So, could they have seen something? Sure, but could they make out facial features? The story didn't make sense, and a few days later, Benson went back there on foot. He returned to the Mauck's home, and he stood inside, looking towards the trailer where Daniel and Jennifer lived. He traced the line of sight with his own eyes from window to window. Now, it's true he could make out movement and shapes and figures walking in the distance, but not faces, not distinctive features, not clothing, and nothing like Daniel had described. Now, this part of the case kind of reminded me of that scene from My Cousin Vinny, where the little old lady's got the thick glasses on, and Vinny takes the measuring tape and he walks to the way back of the courtroom, and he's like putting up fingers, and he says, "How many fingers am I holding up, dear?" And she couldn't tell. Then came the final test. Benson and Tate went back over to Jennifer and Daniel's trailer, and this time, it wasn't for a friendly conversation. They had one specific request. "Can you show us the window? The one that you looked out of that morning?" Daniel and Jennifer welcomed them in again, still offering their help. They walked down the hall and they pointed to the bedroom window, the one they claimed faced the Mauck's driveway. And as soon as Benson stepped into that room, it hit him. The view wasn't just far, it was blocked. I mean, this window had almost a plastic screen over it, and it wasn't see-through. However, there were two little areas that were sort of ripped or cut, and you could push the screen through, and they're sticking up in this photo that I'm showing you on the screen. You could gaze right through that little square. But there's also an obstruction in between the mobile home and the Mauck's house, a structure that looks like a tiny shed or a little storage area with a roof on top. It reminded me of what you would see on top of a well. It obstructed the driveway completely. From that window, there was no way to see someone leaving the front door. No view of a truck. No view you could get of a man. There was no way to observe what Daniel so confidently described. I mean, maybe colors and movement, but not details. And even if that little building hadn't been there, the distance alone, combined with the early morning darkness, made it impossible to pick out the kind of details he had given. You couldn't even tell if a man or a woman was walking out the door. So the detectives wonder, why would Daniel lie about seeing someone? Was it perhaps to cover for his wife's brother, Jeff? They were living on his property for free. He was the person that supposedly found the Mauck's dead that morning. Interesting. Well, they don't want to tip Daniel off, so they play it cool. They go back to the station, and they decide to do a very thorough background check on Daniel and his wife. Remember, they already looked up Jeff, and he didn't even have a criminal record. But now back at the station, Detective Benson is entering 41-year-old Daniel Tavares' name into the system, and he's expecting to see something, maybe something minor, a misdemeanor, disorderly conduct citation, maybe even a probation violation. But what came back was a warrant. Daniel was a wanted man. Law enforcement back in Massachusetts was looking for him for violating his parole. And if you're thinking, wait, parole? Doesn't that mean he was in prison? You'd be right. This wasn't a man with a minor infraction on his record, and I wasn't ready for what Detective Benson uncovered. And he wasn't either, especially since he had just been standing inside this monster's home. A man with disdain for the law, hatred for cops, maybe hatred towards just about anyone. Anyone that he decided he didn't like. Daniel's scary. Daniel killed his own mother. His mother. Back in 1991, when Daniel was 25 years old, he stabbed her. Anne Marie Tavares. He stabbed her 26 times with a carving knife inside their Somerset, Massachusetts home, and she died right there on the floor. When police arrived, Daniel was sitting there banging his head over and over again, jumping up and down and screaming, "I can't take it. I'm hearing voices. I can't take it." Essentially, he was acting as though he was in some sort of mental health episode. And he later tried to explain exactly why he killed his mother with a variety of different reasons. At one point, he said he was given a laced drink that had LSD in it when he went to a bar hours earlier. He also gave another explanation that his mother had various men who would force him to engage in inappropriate acts with her, and he just snapped. He was thinking if I got rid of her, this treatment would stop. Another excuse he gave was that he was just heavily intoxicated, and he started swinging a 12-inch knife, and it caught his mom 26 times. That night, he also stabbed his mother's friend and roommate, Richard Pyrrhus, who tried to help Anne-Marie. He was injured, but Richard survived. Daniel's mother, Anne-Marie, she had worked at a laundromat. She raised Daniel and his 3 sisters all alone as a single mom after his father left when he was only 4. She was protective. She was devoted. She even fought to keep Daniel out of trouble when he was younger. But on January 11th, in the middle of one of what Daniel called his paranoid episodes, she became his target. And when police searched his bedroom, they found 14 different prescription meds, and he was arrested. He eventually pleaded guilty to manslaughter, not murder. A plea deal that was shaped by his supposed extensive mental health issues, and I'm not exactly doubting that to be true, but just wait. He was sentenced to 17 to 20 years in Massachusetts maximum security prison. But prison didn't make him safer, it didn't make him better or reform him, it made him worse. Behind bars, Daniel developed a reputation that correctional officers never forgot. They described him as a cell warrior. It's someone who spends his days screaming, threatening guards, assaulting staff. He would spit at officers, he would urinate on them, he would throw his own feces. Anything that he could weaponize, he would. His behavior lost him over 1,000 days of good time credit. He made himself unmanageable, which made him have to spend 7 years in a disciplinary unit at Cedar Junction, which is like a prison inside of a prison. Because of his behavior, it made him impossible to house anywhere else. He was that much of a problem. And now if you're wondering why he was out, since the maximum would have been 20 years, well, back in the year 2000, he came forward and he wanted to make a deal to get out early. From prison, Daniel writes a letter to the Bristol County Assistant District Attorney claiming to know the location of a murder victim's body, which he said he would disclose, along with other relevant information in that case, in exchange for a reduced sentence. To break it down for you, when his mother was still alive, they lived across the street from a woman who went missing back on October 27th of 1988 when Daniel was only 22 years old. Her name was Gail Botello. She was a 32-year-old mom of 3, and her case was currently unsolved. Her body had never been found. She just disappeared. Daniel said not only did he know who killed her, he knew where she was buried. He was the only witness. Well, of course, this piqued law enforcement's interest, and over the course of the next few weeks and a series of interviews with Daniel, he laid out exactly what he said happened. Daniel said that he was at his house with friends including Gail, her boyfriend Carlos DePonte, and Carlos's brother Gil DePonte. They were all doing coke together, and Daniel was also their dealer, and he explained he had just given Carlos a stash to go out and sell, so he left while Daniel was outside on the phone with his girlfriend Michelle. And he said he was out there about 15 minutes talking on the phone. And when he went back inside, he saw Gil holding a knife, and Gail was on the floor with wounds to her back. I know I'm saying Gail and Gil. Gil had the knife. Gail was stabbed, lying in a pool of blood. And even though Daniel said he didn't witness the killing, he said Gil was the only one there. And when Daniel said, "What happened?" he said Gil confessed. He had stabbed Gail. And Daniel said when he reached for the phone to call 911, Gil pulled out a gun, aimed it at him, and actually fired a shot. But Daniel moved, and the bullet only grazed him. But at that point, he decided to cooperate and stay quiet. He watched Gil and another one of their friends wrap Gail's body in a blanket, bring her downstairs into his own backyard, and they buried her there. Daniel said he ended up growing a tomato garden right on top of it to conceal it. Now, it had been 12 years. And of course, there were new residents who lived at Daniel's former house. But the police went there. And sure enough, they pull up flooring in the bedroom. There's bloodstains underneath. And in the backyard, under a tree, they recovered a human skeleton. And eventually, it was identified as belonging to Gail Botello. An autopsy concluded that she died as a result of homicidal violence, including stabs to her back. Now, authorities initially declined to release the source of the tip that led them there, referring only to a confidential informant. So now you see how this exchange of information was vital to him only serving the minimum of 17 years. And still he didn't stop. In 2006, near the end of his sentence, Daniel began writing threatening letters to public officials and even members of his own family. One letter to his father, Daniel Tavares Sr., promised that when Daniel got out, he would break all of his ribs and maim him. He hadn't changed, and he wasn't charged for these threats because he was an inmate and he wasn't physically capable of carrying out these crimes. But the signs were there that he wasn't going to stop, that he was going to escalate. And just 3 days before his scheduled release in June of 2007, Daniel attacked 2 correctional officers. Massachusetts prosecutors moved fast, asking for a $50,000 bail to keep this man behind bars. His attorney pushed back, though, requesting just $5,000. And I'm thinking, how could anyone defend him? I understand it's their job, and criminals still have rights. But that's when Superior Court Judge Kathy Tuttman made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her career. She sided with his defense. Somehow, she believed that there was no evidence that Daniel posed a flight risk. She really believed that this man was going to show up for his hearings. She released him on personal recognizance. No bail, no ankle monitor, no hold. No warning to the public that this violent offender was now on the loose. He was just ordered to check in with his probation officer 3 times a week, and an arrangement was made for him to live with one of his sisters. And that was that. But Daniel had other plans. He had been waiting to get out, hoping that he could convince a judge that he'd changed. But he hadn't. And he didn't stick around. What Detective Benson discovered was that Daniel had been laying the groundwork for his escape for years. While incarcerated, he had formed an intense and obsessive relationship with an online girlfriend, Jennifer Freitas, who was now his wife. They started chatting through a website called inmate.com, and he was writing her nonstop once he locked onto her. Counselors even documented repeated statements where he planned to move across the country to be with her as soon as he was free. Daniel even tattooed her name on his neck while behind bars. But for anyone evaluating whether he might flee the state, the evidence wasn't subtle. It was explicitly there, and it only took 3 days. He already boarded a plane, and he went from Providence and traveled to Washington State. And he met with Jennifer. And within just a few weeks, when he stopped showing up for his appointments, there was a warrant out for his arrest in Massachusetts, but he was already 3,000 miles across the country. And by late July of 2007, he and Jennifer were married in a small ceremony at Point Defiance Park. Shortly afterward, they settled into that trailer on the rural land in Graham owned by Jennifer's brother, Jeff. The property was secluded. There were old vehicles and other trailers just scattered all over. And it was a place where somebody could easily disappear. And there was Detective Benson staring at these records. A convicted killer released against warnings, left unchecked, now living right down the street from a murdered couple and acting like a witness. This wasn't just a red flag. This was a catastrophic system failure. Daniel Tavares wasn't some drifter. He wasn't a neighbor who saw something strange and reported it. He was a man with blood already on his hands, and Detective Benson had just found out that he should have never been free to kill again, and he probably had. Benson was sure of it. Digging through Daniel Tavares' past felt like trying to unearth a crime scene from the inside out, and he just kept going. By mid-November 2007, Daniel had been living in Washington for months, but on the night of November 16th, the night before Brian and Beverly were found dead, Daniel started to crack. That evening, his father got a phone call. The woman on the other end didn't say who she was. She didn't explain. She just said one sentence. "I'm calling to let you know Daniel's out, and he's on his way to come down there to get you." And then she hung up. for Daniel's father, it was more than enough. He already knew what his own flesh and blood, what his son was capable of. And that night he slept with a gun beside him. But Daniel never showed up. Instead, Daniel went drinking at a small local bar in Graham, Washington called Ma and Pa's Roundup, which was close to the mobile home where he was living. Witnesses there said he was loud, he was picking fights with other patrons and starting arguments for no reason at all. He was making everyone really uncomfortable. It felt like he could become dangerous. And so the staff tried to de-escalate, but eventually they had no choice. They had to kick him out. That was around 11 p.m. Benson didn't think that Daniel ever cooled down that night. Whatever was going on in his head, whatever rage had started to bubble up, it led to Brian and Beverly's murders. He hadn't watched a stranger walk away from the Mauck's home. That story was fabricated. The only reason someone would fabricate a story like that was that specific was because they were trying to steer the investigation away from themselves and onto someone else. But if Benson was going to charge this man, if he was going to lock this case down, he needed to connect Daniel directly to the crime scene. And they already had two pieces of evidence. They had the bloody palm print and the shoe print. They just needed Daniel to give them a sample of his hand. But how are you going to do that without tipping him off that he's a suspect? Their prime suspect. So they had to come up with a plan. Was it a good one? I mean, well, you be the judge. They told Daniel and Jennifer that crime scene technicians had pulled a number of latent prints from the Mauck's home, which was true. And now, in order to eliminate any innocent fingerprints or palm prints from the house, since, Jennifer and him had been there before, Daniel had tattooed Brian at one point, they'd gone over there for parties. The investigators wanted to collect full prints from anyone who ever stepped foot inside. It sounded routine, it sounded harmless, and Daniel and Jennifer agreed. The next day, detectives returned to their mobile home. They brought along a forensic specialist and a palm print card, and they were cooperative and calm. Daniel didn't even ask questions. He didn't seem nervous. The forensic technician carefully inked Daniel's entire hand, rolled his fingers, and took full palm impressions, left and right. They also collected Jennifer's prints for elimination purposes, and when it was done, Daniel actually smirked. And I was sitting there thinking, if this is the killer, he probably thought, I took care of all of my fingerprints. They're not going to find anything. I used the rag. I wiped everything down. I was thorough. He probably thought so when he was heavily intoxicated. But Detective Benson sat with an analyst, just waiting to see if Daniel's prints were going to be a match. And of course they were. But Daniel wasn't done giving himself away. Detectives arranged to bring him in again to the police department, and this time, under the pretense of helping refine that sketch of the man that he claimed had been fleeing the scene. Benson wasn't sure whether Daniel knew the investigation had turned to him, so they sent the sheriff to pick him up, and Jennifer followed behind in her own vehicle, and when they arrived at the sheriff's department, Daniel just stepped out of the patrol car, walked up to the door, but guess what? It had been raining, and there was the shallow puddle, and he stepped right into it and then onto a dry piece of the pavement. And right there between puddles and raindrops falling was dry concrete, and it left behind a clear, wet boot print. Detective Jason Tate happened to be nearby. He looked down. He looked back up at Daniel, who looked back down again. The print matched the Madsen brand boot tread that was left in blood under that sheet at the crime scene. It was exact. Tate took out a camera. He quickly went down there and quietly photographed the footprint before it faded away. Daniel didn't know it yet, but he had just stepped directly into the final piece of evidence the detectives needed, all under the guise of him helping as a witness. Oh, and this man reveled in that, let me tell you. He was feeling like he was helping them catch a killer. He's in the interview room, and he starts almost bragging, almost sort of like you would in a job interview when you're talking about your credentials. Well, Daniel's were his criminal past. Almost to say, listen, guys, I'm experienced. I can help you. But it comes off evil and creepy. Now, I have part of this interview. It's not the best quality, of course it's not, but I'm going to tell you what he says, and then I'll play it for you for context. So Benson built some rapport with him and also admitted that he knew that Daniel had been in prison. And Daniel looks at Benson and he's like, I'm sure you know what I was in prison for. And Benson's like, I heard it was manslaughter. And he says, how'd you kill him? Knowing full well it wasn't him. It was Daniel's own mother. He knew that. But he's letting Daniel speak. And when he does, he said, stabbed him. It was a her. Now, Benson's acting surprised. He's like, oh, it was? And Daniel's like, yeah, it was a family member. Benson asked, what kind of family member? And Daniel just says, mother. As calm as can be. And Benson's like, you killed your mother? And Daniel responds, yeah, I did. And Benson was just like, no kidding.
I'm sure you must know what I was in prison for.
I just heard it was manslaughter, or how'd you kill him?
Stab. It was a her.
Oh, it was?
Yeah, it was. Family member.
What kind of family member?
Mauck.
You killed your mother?
Yeah, I did.
No kidding.
Like, Daniel really thought he was doing something. The only thing he was doing was digging his own grave this time. And the reason I'm pointing that out, his own grave, is because remember Gail Botello? The woman buried in his backyard? Well, the authorities couldn't prove it, but after investigators got that information that Daniel provided, they believed that he was the one who killed her. Yeah. Shortly after her body was recovered, a woman named Lori Montez, one of Daniel's former girlfriends, saw a news report and she contacted the police. She said that a couple days before Halloween back in 1988, Daniel called her and wanted her to come see something over his house. When she got there, he answered the door and he was nervous, but he was also weirdly excited. Like there was just something about him that seemed really off. She followed him upstairs to his bedroom, and there was a large red stain on the floor. She looked at him and realized there was the same red substance all over his hands and his knees and a scrub brush nearby. He had been cleaning what looked like blood from a rug. She was so scared. She turned and ran downstairs, but Daniel caught up to her and he's like, oh my God, it's just a Halloween prank. Now, considering this fact and the fact that both of the men that Daniel said were involved in Gail's murder denied that they killed her, that led back to only one person, Daniel. And when he talked about killing his mother, there was no remorse in his voice, no discomfort in revisiting that memory. Benson noted no emotion in him. That is until Benson pulled the bait and switch on him and revealed that they had evidence inside the Mauck's residence that matched to him. Here's part of that confrontation now.
At this point in time, we've got evidence to arrest you for the murder of Brian and Beverly.
What? I was in bed. That's impossible.
I don't normally do this, but I'm going to show you something. This is your print in blood that we recovered inside that house. These are the patterns on your shoes that you have on your feet right now.
He was either really bold or really dumb or both because he's wearing the shoes that he wore at the crime scene. He knew they got him, so he fessed up. He said it was true. He murdered Brian and Bev. And when you find out why, I told you, it's infuriating. It's so cold and senseless. His excuse was that after drinking and coming back home from the bar, he remembered Brian owed him $50 for that tattoo that he had given him. So he thought it was a good time in the early morning hours of November 17th to go get that money. He said he was knocking on the door for a few minutes, and Brian finally answered, and he was upset that he was woken up so early in the morning, like, couldn't it wait? But the real reason he killed Brian, he said, was because Brian called him a punk, and that set him off. He said that he yelled to Brian, I was in prison for nearly 20 years. Nobody calls me a punk. And when Brian shut the door on him, he snapped. He kicked in the panel and he shot him. And he actually was smiling about this. Daniel told investigators that after he shot Brian, he didn't expect Beverly to come running out, but she did. She was asleep, nude, in the bedroom. The gunfire woke her, and she didn't freeze. She ran fast, trying to make it towards the front door, trying to get out. Daniel said he saw her in motion, he saw her heading to escape, and he shot her too. But in another version, Daniel actually blamed Beverly for the murders. I mean, not that she did it, but that she had insulted his wife, Jennifer. And that is what triggered the violence. But truly, this is just an evil monster. He doesn't need a reason to kill. If he hadn't been in prison, he would have killed again before Brian and Bev. Detectives are sure of it. Then Daniel did something the detectives couldn't stop thinking about. He walked over, he grabbed Bev's body, and he dragged her back into the living room. He didn't place her gently. He didn't position her with intention. He just plopped her down right across her husband, forming that T-shape, stacked and lifeless. He told the detectives it wasn't anything symbolic. It's just where he put her. Then he went into the bedroom, grabbed the sheets to cover them up. Daniel said he panicked, that this wasn't planned, at least not in his mind. But now there was so much blood, and it was everywhere, so he had to try to clean. Now, when his wife Jennifer was interviewed separately, she confirmed key pieces of his account. She told detectives that Daniel had left in the middle of the night, and when he returned, he said the Maucks won't bother us anymore. At the time, she brushed it off. She didn't understand what it meant. And I'm thinking, how did they ever bother them to begin with? But later she realized that Daniel was telling her that he had killed them. Jennifer also admitted that she had gone back to the crime scene after the murders. She was there, and she remembered what they did next. She and Daniel drove to Point Defiance Park, the same place they had gotten married just a few months earlier, and they stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the water, and Daniel pulled out the gun, the .22 caliber murder weapon, and then he threw it over the edge. The gun sank into the water, and it was never recovered. Daniel Tavares was arrested and charged with 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder along with illegal possession of a firearm. And Jennifer Lynn Tavares, his wife, was charged with rendering criminal assistance, a gross misdemeanor, after the detectives concluded that she had lied repeatedly during the investigation and had helped conceal the weapon used to kill Brian and Bev. She served a year in prison, and Daniel was looking at life, but it didn't end there. There is more, but first, I just want to tell you, Brian and Beverly's murders weren't just a tragedy. They were a symbol of something much bigger. A system that knew who Daniel was, knew what he was capable of, and still let him free. Now, it wasn't just Pierce County watching. It was the whole country. The moment that Daniel was arrested for the murders of Brian and Beverly Mauck, the story exploded. The headlines were, "Killer released by judge murders Washington couple. He should have never been free. And no supervision, no bail, and 2 more dead." And soon national voices joined in, and one of the loudest was Mitt Romney. Remember, Daniel had sent him numerous threats from prison. Romney at the time was a leading presidential candidate and the former governor of Massachusetts, the state where Daniel had been released. Romney had actually appointed Judge Kathy Tutman, the one who let Daniel go. And now, with the headlines, Romney went on the record. He said she should resign. He called her decision to release Daniel irresponsible. He said her judgment had endangered lives, and now 2 people were dead because of it. Everyone wanted to hear from Judge Tutman herself. They wanted her to make a statement. And I heard something recently, and it stuck with me. Someone said that every judge who wants to release a violent criminal, as a requirement, they should have to live with that violent criminal in their own home before they allow them on the streets. Maybe that'll make them think twice. But back in Washington, prosecutors weren't interested in statements. They were preparing for a capital murder trial. But as prosecutors prepared for a death penalty case, no less, Daniel made an unexpected move, but it's kind of expected in my point of view. On February 15th of 2008, just 3 months after the murders, he changed his plea. He stood in court and admitted to killing Brian and Bev. There was no apology, just a cold procedural surrender. The guilty plea spared him the death penalty, but It came with a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He could never walk free again. In the weeks after the case closed, the Seattle Seahawks reached out to both of these families. They knew who Brian and Bev were, not just as fans, but as a fixture in the tailgating community. The kind of couple that brought people together, built routines around the game days, made food, made jokes and memories, and now they were gone. So the team did something really cool and special. They invited their families onto the field before a home game against the Arizona Cardinals, and the Seahawks CEO placed his own NFC championship ring in Brian's father's hand and told him to wear it for the game. And later, the organization announced they were raising money for a charity in the couple's honor. They let the family know that Brian and Bev would never be forgotten. But there was someone else, Gail Botello. Her case went quiet, but it didn't stay quiet forever. She too was not forgotten. In 2012, more than a decade after Daniel had first led police to her body, an inmate incarcerated in the same Washington prison as Daniel came forward and said he found a letter in the prison library that Daniel authored, and it confirmed that he wasn't a rat. He didn't tell on Gail's murderers. No, he was the murderer. He also wrote letters confessing, saying that he killed Gail. He wrote one to his former roommate, Richard, the one he had stabbed alongside his mother, another to Detective McDonald, who was the lead on Gail's case, and his former alibi witness, his ex-girlfriend, Michelle Cardozo. Michelle came forward in February of 2013, and she recanted his alibi. Then a grand jury indicted Daniel for Gail's murder in 2013, that same year, and the jury trial began on November 16th of 2015. This was a lot for Gail's family to take in. And the brutal details of this crime, the truth of what happened, was so far from what Daniel told authorities when he tried to, of course, use it to reduce his prison time. Gail had disappeared on October 27th of 1988, and she was last seen around 4 p.m. when she told her boyfriend she was stepping outside to talk to someone who knocked on their door. Does that sound familiar? Someone knocking on the door, just like he did at Brian's. Gail said, "I'll be back in 5 minutes," and she left without even taking her purse. And she never returned. There was an intense investigation that followed. And when she was finally found, after Daniel turned into a so-called confidential informant, the location of where she was this whole time shocked her family. She had been right next door all of those years. But what really happened? We might never know exactly, but Daniel was a dealer, and Gail was a user and buyer. She and her boyfriend supposedly owed Daniel money. Does that also sound familiar? He led her into his house under the pretense that he was going to just do some coke with her. And when she bent down to inhale it, he pulled out a gun, but he said it didn't fire correctly, so he admitted he grabbed a knife, grabbed her by the hair, and stabbed her repeatedly. In this confession, Daniel described in detail how thick the blood was, the smell of it, the noises she made, how she attempted to breathe as blood filled her mouth and throat. This was all repeated in the opening statements for the jury to hear when this trial began. How Daniel watched her die and then lifted her up and dropped her body off a second-floor porch and buried her in a shallow grave under a tree in his backyard. Of course, he was found guilty. I think you could have guessed that. And he's also serving a life sentence for her murder. So if that's any comfort, he will never walk the streets again. Let's hope, though. Let's hope. It's scary to think that sometimes pure evil is right next door, and they don't need a motive to kill.
That's fantastic. Rat, let you know where she was. Are you serious? Clowns.
But as for those left behind to grapple with what this monster has done, that pain never fades. Daniel is a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. An evil person, a serial killer who fell through the cracks. And nothing can undo that. If he would have never been allowed out, he would have never killed Karen's daughter. And I'll leave you with one thing that Karen held on to, because she really should get the final word. She had one tiny comfort in all of this. In the days after her daughter and her daughter's husband Brian were killed, Daniel had a black eye. And the timeline made it clear. He got that black eye before the police arrived. He received it during the murders inside the Mauck's home. Karen believes with all of her heart that her daughter Bev gave him that black eye. She said, "I'm 99% sure of it." Remember, Brian was shot right away as Daniel came through that door, but Bev, she came running to help. Karen said, she may not have had time to scream. She may not have had time to run, but in those final seconds, Karen believes her daughter fought back, and that mattered to her. I want to leave you with that. And I want to thank you so much for being here for Brian and Beverly's story, but also for the story of Gail and for Daniel's mother, Anne Marie. Thank you. Do not forget them. Always be safe. Protect yourself. And I'll see you in my very next video. Bye.